Welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. So we've got a lot to talk about this week. Last week, honestly, when Charlie and I were talking behind the scenes, we actually thought it was a bit of a slow week. Well, that's because we were catching up to this week where we have seen all sorts of stories from NVIDIA, ServiceNow, Microsoft, and we are leaving out stories around IBM, Apple, all sorts of other companies that are doing a bunch of incredible, amazing things or being attacked by the government, all sorts of things that are happening. But for today, we are going to try to focus on the 6 or 7 topics that we think are most important to the CIO office and make sure that we discuss them in detail to help you and guide you through the week. So, Charlie, it's so hard to ignore NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA had their GTC conference last week, and honestly, it's all anybody could talk about for at least a couple of days. So, what stood out to you looking at the intersection of AI and IT and everything else?
Well, let's start with what maybe is obvious or not, I suppose, but that this is a hardware company, or at least in theory, a hardware company, a chip
Yes.
company, again, in theory. And other than maybe Apple, we don't really talk much about hardware these days. Hardware has been abstracted away from almost everything that we do in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mere fact that there's this much attention on this type of a conference is sort of eye-opening in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that I mentioned, I almost didn't like tune in terms of like, is this something that is really, really relevant to an enterprise IT audience, unless you are the biggest companies in the world. And I'm really glad I did tune in, mostly because it was a bit of a wake-up call. It was, for me, astounding the scale of what we're talking about. Incredibly technical. I mean, I don't think I'm a slouch, and I'm like constantly Googling and dropping stuff into, Chat GPT, like what the heck is that? And
Right.
trying to process all these numbers and getting my head around the scale of it. And, effectively talking about an entirely new data center architecture, an entire new computing architecture that is about a scale that is truly unimaginable. I remember I was in Saudi Arabia talking with the CTO for Cray about, HPC, high performance computing, a few years ago. And it was literally like, there's like 10 companies in the world need this level of stuff, right? And now suddenly we're on a main stage of a conference talking about this in very real terms, that and still not the average company, but where this is a mainstream sort of topic at least. um so that was a big takeaway. And I think what's challenging about it is that if I'm an enterprise CIO and I don't work for one of the 50 largest companies in the world, it's probably still not relevant. I'm probably still not buying NVIDIA products
Mm-hmm.
to any great scale and rebuilding my data center. But I do think it's relevant because of some of the things we're going to be talking about. They also introduce some software stuff I know you want to get into, which I think is going to be very, very impactful, even at lower ends, at the more mortal ends of the scale. I also think, though, that it's setting up this big versus small conversation that we're going to have today,
Mm-hmm.
because the scale that they are driving is going to truly create an entire new class. Um, that I think, even, for me, I'm like struggling to get my head around it. So it was, you've heard the phrase drinking from a fire hose. Well, I felt like I got dumped into a circular pit where I had 100 fire hoses hitting at me, and I had to drink from all of them at once. I mean, it was just like overwhelming, just the amount of information, and not even just information, but the imagination that it sort of was sparking of like, where is all this really, really going?
Yes. So I watched the Jensen Huang keynote for GTC along with some CRM analysts, namely Brent Leary, Paul Greenberg, some fantastic minds in the software space. And honestly, for the first hour, when we were watching the hardware detail after detail after detail, honestly, it was mind numbing. Like I know what is semiconductors. I worked for a semiconductor test company, Teradyne. So it's not like I don't understand what a chip is, but even so, the level of detail we were getting into, I was thinking, from a practical perspective, this is not a level that I work at. I don't do chip fab. This is not my life. I work on we're using compute and storage for various use cases. But I feel like even so, the second hour of his keynote got into what could be done with AI at a point that was understandable to almost everybody. People could see, oh, this is how I can put this into field service. This is how I can put this into sales. This is how I could actually create something with AI in a way that perhaps I can't do today, but is going to come up to me in the near future. And I thought that part was very engaging. But I agree with you exactly on that infrastructure abstraction point. So this T-shirt I'm wearing, "Sleep More." Ironically, this is a T-shirt I got from IBM Cloud. I think it's one of their best marketing hashtags ever, because the idea is, you push everything to the cloud and you sleep more. But we are actually going away from that right now, where you actually have to think about hardware again, and all the details are coming back because we're seeing another order of magnitude compute necessary to make everything happen, and we don't have the tools to do it. One of the reactions that I saw from NVIDIA that I thought was really amusing was hearing NVIDIA talk about, oh yeah, all of our customers are already doing like 50 or 100 different types of retrieval augmented generation activities. And I'm like, that is not where the average company is right now. I can assure you of that. They do not have 100 different rags that they're using to augment their generative AI models, right? So there's still this huge gap between where NVIDIA's average enterprise customer is and where the average enterprise is. And I think bridging that gap is going to be an immense change in IT.
Well, there are two follow up points that I think. First of all, I think the reality is most of their customers are not enterprises the way we typically talk about. They are the cloud providers, they are
Mhm.
the mega companies, etc. So I think there's that. Secondly, I mean, frankly, he particularly that first hour, it was over the head of most people in the room, who arguably are the people that are most invested in this. I mean,
Mhm.
it was hilarious. He'd go through something, and it's like he'd pause for applause, and you could tell it's like nobody like we couldn't even absorb it all. It's like, oh, we're supposed to applaud here. It's like we better,
Mhm.
it's the applause lines were, But there was another article which I realized I didn't even send you, from Fast Company, talking about how NVIDIA was demoing an Apple Vision Pro app that
Mhm.
was basically one of the big NVIDIA pushes is this idea of the digital twin. And basically, for this writer, was saying that this is the first time that the light bulb sort of went off about the transformative power of leveraging something like spatial computing, i.e., the Apple Vision Pro,
Mhm.
in combination with a cloud based supercomputer, i.e., NVIDIA's architecture, to render this car in full fidelity that could literally walk around it and inspect it and do everything that you might want to do with it from like a design perspective without actually being there. But of course, being able to change its color dynamically, change configuration, doing all these things. And I think in the second half, that's what you're starting to see, the manifestation of what happens when you start reimagining the architecture. But it is that, and I think one of the things, another article I read, was talking about how we need to probably stop calling NVIDIA a GPU company and probably not even a chip company. And this latest example, or these announcements, were a classic case. I mean, it was half of it was networking and fiber channel and all this other stuff that is necessary because the scale and the speed are so dramatic that everything is different. And so I think it is about sorting out what parts are. I think for me, the big takeaway is, one, recognize that we are at a sea change. We are at a fundamental shift of what the future of computing is going to be. Now, what I'm not sure of is this going to be bifurcated? Are we going to have this future where there's the mere mortal technology and then the big companies that are running this stuff? Or more likely, in my opinion, is maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, it's going to take time, but where this becomes the only computing model and really displaces everything else. And what does that then mean if you're a CIO today who plans on still having a job 10 or 15 years from now? I don't know. I think So I think there's like, you need to at least be aware of all of that, and then the next big thing is the imagination question of like, okay, so as we go down that road, how you better be reimagining things and really kind of paying attention to where this could be going for your organization.
Yeah, and for me, that's why I feel like the announcement that I was able to grasp a hold of most and understand the most was around their new software platform, the NVIDIA inference microservices that they are going to be providing as to be able to help with model deployment. So NVIDIA understands that outside of the geniuses at Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, honestly, a lot of us are not well equipped to actually create models at this point. And although some startups like Databricks are definitely helping with that large language model deployment, it's still hard. So I liked that they are thinking about inferences, microservices, and providing a container that basically says plug and play container to be able to support a model. And then I don't care if you put it on your server or put it in the cloud or whatever. We're just going to give you, the container to be able to move forward and at least get started. I think that's an important piece of the platform, the as a service that is necessary to make these models useful going forward. So at least NVIDIA is thinking about that bridge. Of course, you've got the problem that nobody can buy a GPU anyways because all the big companies have already sucked them up. So all you can do is rent them on the cloud for right now. But at least NVIDIA is thinking about this next step for the CIO, not just the future-facing CTO at a global 50 company, but the rest of us who might actually want to do this going forward.
So I think first of all, I think the introduction of NIMs, as they're being called, I think are is absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Probably one of the things that the Intels of the world always struggled with is getting out of that. I'm just buried in the data center kind of thing where people didn't have any exposure to it. So they're capitalizing very much so, I think, on their brand recognition right now and putting themselves in the place where people are going to be interacting much more directly with the brand, and I think that is brilliant. I'm not convinced, at least out the gate, that we're going to see a whole lot of traditional enterprise adoption of NIMS. I still think it's an abstraction layer away for most organizations today, but the mere fact that it's going to be available in the the AWS and the Azure marketplaces, and it's a plug and play function, means that now these traditional enterprises at least can start playing with it. They can start, spinning these things up and seeing how they can start experimenting with it. And I think that is going to put them in a new class. But I think we're clearly, I think, going to see the very first adopters of this are going to be, and I know we're going to be talking about this in a little bit, but like the ServiceNows of the world that are saying, hey, this is a way to accelerate our own adoption of leveraging some of what we're doing to build some proprietary tech, proprietary models using this and not having to build all this. So I think, it is very, I still find it shocking that, this is a company that basically made, a gaming chip. That's what this all started with, right?
Yes.
And is now the torchbearer for effectively anything that's related to AI. And it's shocking to me. So, but yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the NIMS in particular play out, because it's sort of a bridge to the mortal world.
Yeah, they've been both lucky and good. And of course, there's a very mixed record for infrastructure and chip companies trying to become software companies. Intel wanted to be a software company. EMC wanted to be seen as a software company. We're seeing with Broadcom and VMware right now, which we talked about last week. Broadcom wants to be a software company. All these hardware companies want to be software companies. But with all the hype around AI, NVIDIA actually has a shot to bridge that gap that so many other large and very successful companies have struggled to do.
Yeah, what I will be curious about on that particular front is that the challenge with the approach they're taking. So again, I think it's brilliant, but the challenge is that if I'm Amazon or if I'm Azure, if I'm Microsoft, I have no differentiation if I can get the exact same NIM from either player, right? And so it's going to lead to, you're already seeing it, right? That the major cloud providers are going to be doing versions of this themselves. And so I think it's going to be an interesting sort of, competitive partner sort of relationship that exists, as this is what always happens, right? Every chip manufacturer or every hardware maker wants to get into software because it's much more scalable. I don't have the incremental cost of producing a piece of hardware. So they want to be in the software business, but they're partnered with the software companies that are building stuff on top of their chips. And the minute they start competing with them in some way, then you get this conflict. And it generally, as you pointed out, doesn't go that well for the hardware companies. So
Mhm.
it will be very curious to see how this plays out over time. But I do think the advantage that NVIDIA has is A, they have complete dominance, and B, I think that there is so much demand right now that there's plenty of opportunity and people will be experimenting with everything. But yeah, it was just stuff going on.
Yes. So we could talk about NVIDIA probably for the rest of the hour, but we are talking about software and AI, and there are other companies that also did things with AI and software this week. One that comes up to mind is ServiceNow, which is known for doing their biannual releases, has come out with its latest release, and in tradition with naming each version after a global city, this one is Washington D.C. So we are up to W now. They're starting to run out of the alphabet, so we'll see what happens after that. But it was interesting to see, of course, that their version was put AI front and center. In fact, it's about all that you can see inside this new version. That a bunch of these AI related features, and it's hard to ignore that because ServiceNow is now a core part of basically every Fortune 500 IT environment in some way, shape, or form. So I'm not going to say that every new version is groundbreaking, but this one had a few few interesting, at least tweaks that should be considered. Um, what do you think?
Well, so I don't know if I should admit this, but it was the very first thing I saw when I saw the announcement about Washington D.C. was exactly that. It's like, wow, what are they going to do when they get to Z? First of all, what are they going to be the X, particularly X and Z cities, and then what are they going to do 4 releases from now when they're out of the alphabet? I mean, are they just going to start over? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of hilarious that they picked this
Mm-hmm.
thing that it has become cemented. But yeah, so to me, the big news about this release was sort of the non-release nature of it. There was not a whole lot in it. I mean, the Now Assist for ITOM is interesting, and I think this is something that we've all seen coming. It was the one of the first things that I know when Gen AI started getting real traction. It was the first place my mind went. It's like, well, there's nothing that isn't made for this than going through alerts and giving me in plain English, hey, give me the Star Trek computer. This you have a problem
Right.
here. It's like so I think in that regard it's good, and I don't want to minimize it. Um, but it wasn't, there's nothing particularly, in fairness, I haven't seen a demo of it, so maybe it's more groundbreaking when you actually see it. But at least from reading about it, I didn't go, oh my gosh, wow, that is shocking. What I did find interesting, and we sort of alluded to this a minute ago, is that as part of this, they announced a partnership with, or an extension of their partnership with NVIDIA. They
Mm-hmm.
announced that they will be adopting the NIMS, and building on top of that. And what I think, when I read through all of that, the big takeaway was that we're in this very interesting era. We've talked a little bit about it in the past, about this shift away from what really I think has been the defining factor for Silicon Valley and for the tech industry for the last 20, 25 years, and the scrappy startup model, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
you got VC funding, and the innovation was happening in these small companies. That the big companies would spin off some, their smartest people would run off, go get funding, and start this really innovative company that would then sort of drive the market forward. And what I think is really interesting, and I'm not saying that's dead, but
Mm-hmm.
if I look at the space and look at ServiceNow's would be competitors, the people that are typically doing 30, 50, 100 million in revenue and trying to compete with them in some way, they can't compete here. They cannot form a partnership with NVIDIA, not of anything that's meaningful. They're not going to have the wherewithal to go down this road. And as AI and as NVIDIA continue to drive the market, it's going to make it harder and harder if I'm a CIO to look at these smaller companies and say, how are they going to keep pace?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was for me, the big aha. And we have a couple other pieces to talk about, I think are kind of bringing that point home. But that was my big takeaway. It wasn't so much the release itself as much as what it signals as to where this road is leading.
Yeah, I think of Now Assist. The claim is around bringing IT jargon to standard business level language, and not so long ago, that would have been a standalone startup. Some company would have said, "We just raised $12 million Series A to translate IT into business," and everybody would have been all excited about it. Nowadays, you have to be the $5 billion or whatever ServiceNow's annual revenue is, to be able to put out something like that and have it actually make a difference in the IT world. Because you might be a 10 or 15 $1 million startup that tries to do this, but you will get swallowed up by ServiceNow for this specific use case, and for a lot of these generative AI related use cases. So given that, I think it's kind of good for us to dive into the money a little bit, understanding how is this changing? How are new innovations coming to the market differently in 2024, and how has that shifted from 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And one of the articles you brought up, before this call that I found really interesting was that there's this new era for VCs, venture capital and private funding, that we have to change the way that we look at how funding is happening for companies, because it changes the way that CIOs are trying to invest, and trying to partner and trying to identify new solutions that they can integrate into their ecosystems. It's a big challenge right now. We live in a world where the average large multi-billion-dollar enterprise has over 1,000 SaaS apps, and honestly is trying to cut down. But at the same time, there are more and more capabilities that CIOs continue having to bring into their environments. Business is not getting less complicated or less distributed by any means.
Yeah. So this article is actually from a Substack called Digital Native by a gentleman by the name of Rex Woodbury, who is a VC. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting from my standpoint because, I'm an IT guy, so I haven't actually had that much exposure throughout my career to the whole world of VCs and private equity and funding, right? I've just been the consumer, and even as an analyst, that's been the perspective that I've brought. It's like, that might be a signal, but that hasn't been my focus. And so this article it's a little bit of inside baseball. It's a little bit talking about sort of the evolution of the industry. But what it's really, the big point it's trying to make is that historically, that the VC or any investors really, they're two things they're bringing, right? It's about labor and it's about capital. And that investment profile is, historically was sort of both. And what, his proposition, I guess, or his supposition is that it's diverging, that there's now going to be this sort of class of VC that is really focused on the labor, that's focused on building out the team and identifying, how to nurture that team. And it's about the smaller bets. What I would argue is kind of the traditional VC road. But you're now seeing this other sort of angle, but that it's really focused on capital, that it's about big bets, big funds, large investments. Mm-hmm. And I think it speaks to what we've been talking about. And, he sort of leaves it on the fence, but I think he's sort of implying that there's a case to be made that the artisan, as he calls it, investing makes a ton of sense, and that's going to create the great innovation. And I think there's probably a lot of truth and value in that. But as we've been pointing out, I think it's also going to be really dependent on the use case, on what the focus is, because, as we've been talking about, is the whole NVIDIA thing is pointing out, so much of this is about these big swings now, and that the cost of doing it. The one thing that we sort of didn't talk about is that, the NVIDIA proposition, that this new data architecture, not only is it a whole new thing, it's insanely expensive.
Yes.
And so, if you're going to these use cases that are leveraging this sort of technology, there's a massive amount of money involved in doing that. And therefore you're getting these huge funds and huge investments. And that's why we're now seeing things we never saw startups getting $1 billion in funding before.
Right.
And now we're seeing it happen with almost a routine kind of thing. And so I think it just, for me, putting the CIO lens on, it just means that I think you can't just be looking at a potential software company, particularly if they're a startup, and solely look at their feature set and are they helping you solve a problem. That should always be your starting point. But I think now you need to look at where are they getting their investments from? What do they say? Do they have enough money to compete in this space? Is this just going to be a good idea, but are they going to be able to be big enough to play? And I think it's something that historically we just didn't think about, at least in those same terms. And so that was my big takeaway when I was reading this article. It was really, I highly recommend it. It was really fascinating.
Yeah. So I started my career working at venture capital backed startups. And let me tell you, the fundraising part is not fun. You create a deck and you sell yourself to 100 different firms. It is a very hardcore sales process that is very repetitive. And unless you really enjoy that pitching, it's not a very enjoyable process. I think even if you do, it's a very repetitive thing since you're selling a very specific thing over and over and over again. But be that as it may, I feel like the process was more straightforward, call it 20 years ago, where you were trying to raise $10 million with the promise of getting to, call it, a $50 million a year business. The idea is you're adding some rocket fuel to an idea that was ready to go and was going to make some money over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And if you had the opportunity to get to the next level, okay, that's where you get your $50 million round. So you can get to being a $1 billion business. Pretty straightforward. There was some relationship between the amount of funding and then the amount of revenue you're trying to make and the type of valuation you're getting to. And then somewhere over the last 5 years or 5, 6 years, this disconnect started happening because valuations started getting so high and being so divorced from reality that you just kind of threw $50 million at something and hoped that you would get to $1 billion valuation because you didn't actually have to sell anything to get there. It's like, it was kind of like the .com era all over again, where you could just kind of throw money at an interesting idea or some sort of cyber currency or some sort of metaverse idea or what have you, and you kind of got there. And I think we kind of saw that just because you had $100 million in funding as a startup didn't mean that you were necessarily a viable startup or a service that a CIO could invest in. We kind of got to that point, and now we're trying to figure out how to get back to the point where having a couple of years of runway, actually what defines a couple of years of runway and what makes you at least worth investing in or worth gambling in. And it's hard because some of these startups happening now in the AI space specifically need a lot of infrastructure and a lot of commitment. Like we saw just last week, Microsoft basically bought out the leadership team of Inflection AI, which raised over $1 billion. We see OpenAI, they got $10 billion in commitment, not necessarily all direct funding, but be that as it may, multi-billions of dollars in investment. And we're seeing very similar types of commitments to the likes of Anthropic, Cohere, everybody who is serious about the AI game. They have at least the ability to access $1 billion from somewhere. I have no doubt of that because those are the table stakes for getting in. And honestly, that's what you have to consider from the IT side. If we are investing in this type of LLM or this type of AI technology, is there that $1 billion backing, even if it's not a formal $1 billion commitment? Are there purse strings at the end of the day that can lead back to that kind of money? Like it just has to be part of that AI consideration that we're looking at right now.
I think it's the purse strings. I think it's also about really looking at the technology, and I think the inflection as a AI is a great example of this. Mm-hmm. So their tool called Pi, which is still available. I still have it on my phone and I still use it. I think it is the best from a conversational AI perspective of all of them. It's better, in terms of actual usability and interaction. It asks questions back, and it's this very so like if maybe I shouldn't admit this. I use it as sort of my rent-a-friend, right? If I don't want to burden one of my actual friends with this, but I like want to discuss something out loud rather than
Mhm.
just talking to myself, I'll go have a conversation with Pi because it says, "Oh, have you thought about this?" And I respond, and it says, "Oh, that's an interesting perspective. What about that?" And right, and it's like a dialogue, and it's
Mhm.
this great technology, but it wasn't enough, right? Just having superior technology. I became aware of it because Bill Gates was actually very bullish on it.
Mhm.
And so, Microsoft acquiring, acquihiring effectively, right? So they took all the lead staff and then licensed the thing. Basically, effectively sort of did an acquihire. I think was signaling two things. One is that Microsoft also has consumer ambitions, right? That's what they've
Mhm.
sort of said that that's what this team is going to be doing is building out their consumer AI efforts. And then it leaves Inflection looking at this and saying, okay, they're now starting to look at what business use cases they can build with this technology to kind of take it to the next level. So I think, and this like goes all the way back to the conversation around what ServiceNow is doing with AI, is that if I'm a CIO today, and I mean honestly, it's so complex now because you have to. It's not as simple as I have a problem, let's go find a solution. You now need to be looking at this from a much broader perspective, looking at the company, looking at the leadership team, try to get a sense of where they're going. Something I tell people all the time, a vendor is like enterprise executives are buying visions, and this is why because it
Mhm.
is so flippin' hard to figure out all these moving parts. It's like what I need to hear from you is what is your vision of where things are going, and does that align with where I think the world is going? And if so, then you're someone I can partner with. And I think we're watching this stuff play out in real time, and going all the way back to this is hard if you're not a $1 billion funded company. What do you
Mhm.
do? Well, I think you need to be focusing on very specific problems that you're solving. And then, what not to do, you need to be careful that you're playing it straight and you're talking about things in real terms about the problems you actually can solve, and you better be zeroed in. So the SEC just introduced some warnings. I don't know if there's anything, more formal about it, but basically warning companies, and they've actually filed a few lawsuits on companies about what they're calling AI washing, right? Talking as if they are delivering some form of AI technology when in fact they're not. And I can sort of get it in terms of if you are a company that you woke up a year ago and go and said, "Oh my gosh, there's now all this AI technology everywhere, and
Mhm.
we're not an AI company. What do you do with it?" Um, that you're trying to compete, but we also have to just be honest about what you're delivering. And so it's just this really interesting kind of complex, turbulent time. And you have to sort of on both sides of the equation. If you're a tech vendor, find that path where you're being honest. And if you're the buyer, if you're the CIO or the enterprise IT exec, that you're asking the hard questions and you're looking at it from that big picture.
Yeah, and that SEC warning about AI washing, I feel is going to be an interesting opportunity for CIOs because there's going to have to be this technical definition of what actually is AI, and it's very difficult to figure out right now, especially for the layperson, because everything has been AI washed for the past decade. Every time somebody uses a predictive equation, even any mention of calculus, any mention of linear algebra, any mention of college level math suddenly gets turned into AI in the software world right now, and that's difficult because everything's been called AI for a decade, and now the SEC is gonna call your bluff and say, oh, that's not actually AI, or that's not AI at a level that the average person actually thinks is AI. We're gonna have to deal with these definitions of what actually consists the complexity of AI, and in today's 2024 terms, I think that's going to end up meaning, is there some sort of transformer based large language model, or is there some sufficiently complicated neural net that goes beyond a basic equation or a basic algorithm to be actually considered AI? And now we have to actually determine which services are actual AI or versus what has been called AI for the past decade.
Yeah, and I think it is going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge because I think CIOs are going to be called to report to the board on their application of AI, and so they're sort of almost going to be dealing with the same challenge around AI washing. And for me, it's also it's challenging on a couple of fronts, right? The SEC thing specifically, it's like, well, so if I have partnered with OpenAI and I'm using their API to pull in some form of an inference, am I legitimately using AI? Sure. So is it AI washing? I don't know, right? So I think there's that side of it. It's like, so as a enterprise IT leader, really getting discriminating about understanding what they mean and how it's being applied, and in the end, the value you're getting from. And then as far as the broader question, I mean, like I don't know if I disagree. I mean, I guess I haven't thought about it, but to me, anything that isn't rules based, anything that isn't if then, I think can legitimately called some form of AI if there's an algorithm, particularly if it's a machine generated algorithm, to go and figure out what that is. And there's lots of forms of that are not just LLMs, right? And what we
Right.
traditionally called AI before LLMs. And I am a little wary that those people that had very real AI based technology prior to this, are going to get so kind of categorized as not real, because of it, and that would be a shame. So I mean, there's so like I said, there's so much going on. It is so hard to kind of get your head around all of this. And if I'm a CIO today, I'm staying laser focused on the business problems I'm trying to solve. I'm just trying to take that half step back and make sure I keep that bigger picture so that I'm not placing the wrong bets on organizations and technologies that just aren't going to stand the test of time.
Yes. In talking about making bets, there have been, uh, over the past, I would say, quarter century, there's been a lot of focus on not being locked into a technology or not being locked into a vendor. And often that is meant looking specifically at open source technologies. It has always been seen as kind of an exit or a way to be more flexible by not being defined or at least having to work with a closed code base. But it looks like that's starting to change, right? We're starting to see evidence that the open source model, at least from a business perspective, isn't quite working the way we want, despite some successes out there, such as Red Hat, being the shining example. Um, so, I know you have some thoughts there on where open source seems to be headed from a practical
Well,
perspective.
yeah, and I think so. So I think there's a couple of angles to this particular
Mhm.
storyline. So what kicked us off? There's an article in Runtime, about Redis moving away from their, I forgot what they're calling it, but they're not a full open source model. There's source available for some of it. Um, but I think it is indicative of the fact that I think they are not the only ones that we are seeing this sort of shift away from this focus on open source in general. Here's what I think is interesting from an enterprise perspective. I feel like it's always been a bit of a red herring. I mean, there are not. I mean, it's undeniable on one end that virtually every major enterprise had open source running in some way, shape, or form. But by the same token, almost none of them, except in test beds and whatever, would really be running anything in production on a non-supported open source something. So they were always paying for it in some way because they couldn't run the risk of just truly being out on their own. And most of the time when I would talk to an enterprise executive about it, they would either say that they were negative on open source because of the support concerns or challenges, or at the very least ambivalent about it, that they sort
Mhm.
of didn't care. They were just focused on solving the problem, and whatever the best way to solve it was the best way to solve it. And the whole pitch, because I remember talking to open source vendors, it was always about, oh, no lock in and it's open and blah blah. And that sort of go to market pitch almost always fell on deaf ears in the traditional enterprise suite. Now, I think
Mhm.
in the cloud providers and in any of the tech companies, whole nother ballgame, and that's been, I think, the interesting part. And that's what I think this whole shift is sort of signaling, is that there's this interesting dynamic where it's not even holding the water in the tech community as much anymore. And I think we'll see that there's this last gasp, right? So you have Facebook or Meta with Llama, and Elon Musk with Grok, however it's pronounced,
Mhm. Grok.
right? Going and bringing these AI models out as open source plays, sort of as a way to attempt to compete and upend the non-open sourced dominant players right now. And I personally don't think it's going to work. I think that they're not going to get the traction. And I think it's going to be sort of the signal that that open source era is sort of coming to an end, maybe strong, but the dominance that it really had for a long, long time, I think maybe waning.
Yeah, I always feel like open source projects always succeeded best when you had a very committed community of people who had a shared goal and a shared ethos. That and this was easier to find back when, frankly, it was hard to get on the internet. It was hard to be online. It was hard to get into technology. So by default, almost everybody who got into tech had a very similar mindset, and it led to being able to push open source projects more easily. But I think we are seeing kind of this not quite bifurcation, where on the one hand we have all these projects that were passion projects and then were abandoned over time. There's this great XKCD comic about all modern digital infrastructure being open source, and all of it being dependent on this one tiny project, supported by one individual who's been doing this as a passion project for decades. And you knock that one little block out, and we would basically lose all of modern digital infrastructure. And then on the other side, you have the open source projects in name that are actually often pushed by IBM or Oracle or other gigantic $100 billion companies. And really, they are using open source as a way to be able to get free labor out of a bunch of people, while being able to show that they are technically part of the technology community and be able to do some open source washing with these technologies that end up being commercial projects. And
I don't want to be cynical about it, I suppose, and that I think there's a lot of genuine contribution, and there was a genuine sense of, to your point, 15, 20 years ago, a genuine sense of community
mm-hmm.
Around this development, and in large part, it was about sort of breaking the paradigm of the IBMs of the world, the traditional closed monolithic technology platforms, where it was all housed in one space, and this idea that we could democratize that. And I think, the issue is, and look, maybe it'll come back, right? But I think it had its time and place. And we're now in this sort of hybrid open era where it's less about hiding the technology, but it's more about the fact that we have to make this stuff so sustainable, because it is now, everything that's running on it is so critical that you just the fundamental principles that drive most of the sort of open source ideas just don't work as well. And I did not take it as a huge bad thing. I think the article from Runtime pointed out that the biggest impact will be on a bunch of cloud providers that have been using the open source version of Redis, and now suddenly they're going to have to start paying for it. Right, that's the big impact, that a lot of people were sort of getting a lot of these people they're using as a free ride for some go-to-market product. It's not going to have a dramatic impact on most enterprises, and I think in the long run, it's probably going to be, a more normalized state. So, we'll see, but I think it's definitely, it kind of goes hand in hand with all these other conversations, that I think that we're entering this sort of new era of what the tech industry is going to look like.
There are startups like Tidelift, which are actually all about supporting individual maintainers, which I'm pretty excited about, because I hope they provide some sort of framework for companies to be able to better support projects over time. But right now, we do have these gaps between either the corporate funded open source projects or the open source projects that are doing yeoman's work in supporting the rest of the world without really any sort of guarantees of how they will be maintained over time.
Yeah, no, I do think there's probably an exception to be made there's a handful of these like, lack of a better term, middleware. They're not really middleware, but these foundational technologies that are very useful to these others, and I think those will probably remain as open source type projects, because there's a shared interest in them. But yeah, I think it's just going to be an interesting evolution as this continues to play out.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I don't know. Did we cover all the news that, I mean, there was a whole lot. I feel like we've been like going on speed here trying to cover it all, but I think that may have been it, huh?
That was it from the half that we decided to talk about. So I'll just say that the half that we did not talk about, we noticed that there were themes around data quality and how they are improving AI. We are seeing technology companies challenged with how they are approaching their marketing and communications efforts that are pretty obvious. We didn't even touch Apple being approached by the Department of Justice on antitrust issues. We know that these are topics that are interesting, but we have run out of time for this week. So we will probably have some comments on these next week as some of these activities and events play out in the news cycle. But for now, I think we're going to have to call it a week.
All
As
right.
always, yes, as always, it's been great to catch up with you and to chat about this wacky world of enterprise IT that we are in.